Mom, we sold a house. That was the first thing Daniel said when he stepped into my living room. Like it was something ordinary, something a son could just drop into a quiet Tuesday afternoon between a cup of coffee and small talk about the weather. And I remember the way I smiled, slow and polite, because that's what I've always done. I keep things calm. I keep things steady even when something doesn't sit right in my chest. Even when a sentence like that lands a little too heavy for no reason I can explain yet. And before I could ask anything else, before I could even process what we sold the house really meant, Sophia walked in behind him, her heels clicking softly against my hardwood floor, her eyes scanning the room not like a guest, but like someone evaluating a space, measuring it, adjusting to it. And then Daniel added, almost casually, "We'll stay with you for a while just until we figure things out." And I nodded again, because that's what mothers do. We make room. We always make room even when no one asks if there's space to give. And I remember thinking it would be temporary, a few weeks, maybe a month at most, just enough time for them to settle something new, something better, because Daniel had always been responsible, always the kind of boy who planned ahead, who thought things through, the kind of son you trust without needing explanations. But something about the way Sophia set her purse down on my kitchen counter, not near the edge like a visitor would, but right in the center like it belonged there, made a small, quiet thought flicker in the back of my mind. A thought I didn't want to name yet because naming it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I asked the simplest question I could find, the kind that doesn't sound suspicious, the kind that keeps everything polite and easy. "Oh, why did you sell?" And Daniel hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for me to notice, before he gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "It just made sense financially." And I nodded again, even though I didn't understand what made sense meant when it came to giving up a house they'd only bought 3 years ago, a house I'd visited, a house I'd helped them paint, a house that had seemed like the beginning of their future, not something you walk away from without a clear reason. But I let it go because that's what I've learned to do over the years. You let small things go so the big things don't break. And Sophia was already opening cabinets in my kitchen, glancing inside like she was memorizing where everything was, and she said, almost to herself, "This layout actually works better than I expected." And I felt that same quiet weight settle deeper in my chest, heavier now, more defined, but still without a name, because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it slips in slowly, through small moments, through offhand comments, through the way someone looks at your home like it's already theirs. And as I stood there, holding my coffee cup a little tighter than usual, I realized something I couldn't quite explain yet, something that didn't match the words they were saying or the smiles they were wearing, something that felt off, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. And I told myself I was overthinking, that this was just a temporary arrangement, that families help each other, that this was normal, but deep down, in that quiet place where instincts live before logic catches up, I knew this wasn't just about them needing a place to stay. And I had a feeling that whatever made sense financially wasn't the whole story, not even close. The first night they stayed, I offered them the guest room, the one at the end of the hall with the soft blue walls and the quilt I'd sewn years ago, the room that always felt like it was waiting for someone who needed rest. But Sophia stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes moving across the space slowly, and then she gave a small, polite smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "Is a little small, don't you think?" And before I could respond, Daniel stepped in behind her and said, "Mom, we were actually thinking it might make more sense for us to take the master bedroom, just for now, since we have more things." And I felt something inside me pause, not break, not yet, just pause like a clock skipping. A second, and I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the boy I raised, the one who used to ask before taking anything that was not his, the one who used to carry my grocery bags without being told. But all I saw was a man who was already moving past me, already assuming the answer. And I heard myself say, "Of course, if that is easier for you," because the words came out automatically, the way they always do when you have spent a lifetime making things easier for other people. And that was how I ended up sleeping in the guest room that night, listening to the faint sounds of movement from what used to be my room, drawers opening, footsteps crossing the floor, the quiet shifting of a life that was no longer mine. And I told myself again that it was temporary, that this was just a short adjustment, that families help each other. But the next morning I woke up to the smell of coffee, stronger than usual, And when I walked into the kitchen, Sophia was already there, standing at the counter, reorganizing my cabinets, moving plates from one shelf to another as if she had always known a better way to arrange them. And she glanced at me briefly and said, "I hope you do not mind. I just thought this would be more efficient." And I nodded, because what else do you do in a moment like that? When someone changes your home without asking, when the lines between help and control begin to blur so quietly that you almost miss it. And Daniel was sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely looking up as I poured myself a cup of coffee, and I noticed that he did not ask how I slept, did not ask if I was comfortable in the smaller bed, did not notice at all that I had given up something that had been mine for decades without a single word of discussion. And later that afternoon, I walked into the living room and saw that the framed photographs I had kept on the mantel, pictures of Daniel as a child, pictures of holidays, of birthdays, of a life, built slowly over years, had been moved, not removed entirely, just shifted to a side table near the window, replaced by a decorative arrangement. Sophia had brought with her something neutral, something that did not belong to any memory, and I stood there for a moment, looking at that empty space above the fireplace where my life used to be displayed, and I felt that quiet thought return, stronger now, clearer, no longer just a feeling but something closer to understanding, and I realized that nothing in this house was being treated as temporary, not the room, not the kitchen, not the way things were being changed piece by piece. And as I watched Sophia adjust the angle of a vase like she was settling into a place she intended to keep, I understood something I had not wanted to admit the day before, something I could no longer ignore. They had not come here to stay for a while. They had come here as if they already belonged. It did not happen all at once. That was the strangest part. Nothing broke loudly. Nothing shattered in a way that would force me to react. It was quieter than that, slower, like something shifting beneath the surface where you cannot quite see it, but you can feel it changing the ground under your feet. And by the third day, I began to notice the rhythm of their presence, the way the house no longer moved around me, but around them. The television stayed on later than I was used to, the lights in. The hallway remained bright long past the hour I would normally turn them off, the thermostat adjusted without anyone asking me. Warmer in the mornings, cooler at night. Small changes that should not have mattered but somehow did because they were not mine, and I told myself again that I was being sensitive, that this was what it looked like when more people shared a space, that compromise was part of kindness. But then there were moments that did not feel like compromise at all, moments that felt like decisions being made without me. And that was when I started to pay closer attention, not openly, not in a way that would create tension, just quietly, the way you do when something inside you begins to ask questions you cannot ignore. And it was late that afternoon when I heard it, not clearly at first, just a fragment of a conversation drifting from the kitchen while I stood in the hallway. Their voices low, but not careful enough. And I heard Sophia say, "The 620,000 is already in place." And Daniel replied something I could not fully catch, something about timing, something about not rushing anything yet. And I felt my hand tighten slightly against the wall beside me. Not out of fear, not out of anger, just a reflex, like my body reacting before my mind could organize what I just heard. Because numbers like that do not appear in casual conversation, not in my world. Not in the life I had been living where every dollar was accounted for, where I had spent years stretching a fixed income, choosing between small repairs and small comforts. And suddenly there it was 620,000, spoken so easily, so casually, as if it belonged to a different reality entirely. And I stepped back quietly before they could notice me, moving down the hall with the same steady pace I always used because there was no reason to let them know I had heard anything. Not yet. And as I sat down in the guest room, on the edge of the bed that still felt unfamiliar beneath me, I tried to fit that number into everything I had been told, into everything I thought I understood. And it did not fit. Not with the idea of them needing a place to stay, not with the explanation that selling their house had simply made sense. Because people who have that kind of money do not need to move into someone else's home unless there is something else going on, something that has not been said. And that was the moment the quiet feeling I had been carrying since they arrived began to take shape. Not just a sense that something was off, but a realization that something had been hidden carefully, deliberately, and I found myself asking a question I had not dared to ask before, not out loud. Not to them, but to myself if they had that kind of money, then why were they here in my house, sleeping in my bed, rearranging my life as if it were theirs? And for the first time since they walked through my door, I did not push the thought away. I let it sit there, fully formed, steady and cold, because whatever the answer was, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had not told me the truth. I did not confront them that evening, or the next morning, or even the day after that, because there is a difference between knowing something is wrong and understanding exactly how it is wrong. And I have learned over the years that moving too quickly can cost you the truth. So instead, I stayed quiet. I watched, I listened, and I let the house speak to me in the ways it always had, through small changes, through patterns, through the things people do when they believe no one is paying attention. And once I started looking, really looking, it became harder to ignore what had already begun to shift around me. Daniel spent more time on his phone than he did speaking to me, stepping outside for calls he did not explain, lowering his voice when I entered the room, and Sophia had begun to treat every part of the house as if it were a project in progress, replacing the hand towels in the bathroom, reorganizing the pantry again, even though she had already done it once, making comments about what could be improved, what could be updated, what would increase the value. And that word stayed with me, value, because it was not a word I had ever used to describe my home. Not in that way, not like it was something to be measured and optimized, to be adjusted for return. And one afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the small guest room that had become mine, I realized that the dresser I had used for years in my own bedroom had been emptied, my things neatly packed into boxes and stacked in the corner, labeled in Sophia's handwriting, clean, organized, efficient, as if my life had been reduced to items waiting to be stored. And I stood there for a long moment, looking at those boxes, feeling that same quiet pause inside me expand into something steadier, something clearer, because this was no longer about discomfort or adjustment. This was about displacement, about being moved aside without ever being asked if I was willing to step aside. And later that day, I decided to do something I had not needed to do before, something simple, something that should not have felt like a line being crossed. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, the same one I had used for years to pay bills and check emails, and I searched for their house, the address still familiar to me, the street name I had driven to so many times, and it did not take long to find it. The listing was there, clear and undeniable, marked as sold, with a date that matched almost exactly with the day they arrived at my door, and I stared at the screen, at the photographs of rooms I recognized, now empty, staged for strangers, and beneath it the number, the sale price, a number that made everything I had overheard begin to settle in a place. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to confirm that what I had heard was real, that the $620,000 was not an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. It was part of something larger, something deliberate. And as I closed the laptop slowly, I realized that the question had changed. It was no longer whether they had told me the truth, because they had not. That much was certain. The question now was why they had chosen to come here, to my home, with that kind of money already in motion, and why they had chosen not to tell me. And as I sat there in the quiet, with the house around me no longer feeling entirely like my own, I understood that whatever answer I was looking for, I would not get it by asking. I would have to find it myself. The next morning, I made breakfast the way I always had, eggs in the same pan, toast in the same toaster, coffee brewed just the way I liked it, because routines have a way of reminding you who you are when everything else begins to shift. And for a moment, standing there in my own kitchen, I almost felt like things could still be normal. But that feeling did not last long, because when Sophia walked in, she did not hesitate. She did not pause the way a guest would. She moved straight to the cabinet where I kept the mugs, reached in without looking, and took one as if she had already memorized the space. And then she glanced at the plate I'd set down and said, "You know, we should probably start eating a little healthier, less butter, more whole grains." And I nodded slowly, even though I had not asked for advice, even though I had been feeding myself just fine for decades. And Daniel sat down at the table, barely looking up again, his attention fixed on his phone, and I watched him for a moment, waiting for him to say something, anything, something that acknowledged I was still part of the space, that I was still more than just the person providing it. But he only said, "Sophia is right. Mom, we can make a few improvements around here and there." It was again that word improvements, as if my home was something unfinished, something in need of correction. And I realized then that this was no longer about small changes or temporary adjustments. This was about control, quiet and steady, taken piece by piece. And later that afternoon, I stepped outside to check the mail, something simple, something ordinary, and my neighbor Linda was standing by her mailbox, the same way she always was around that time. And she smiled when she saw me. Warm and familiar, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has known you long enough to notice when something is different. And she asked, "So, how long are they staying with you?" And I gave the same answer I'd been giving myself, just for a little while. And she tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting just enough for me to notice. And then she said, almost casually, "That is surprising. I thought Daniel and Sophia did pretty well after selling their place." And I felt that quiet weight return again, heavier this time, sharper, because hearing it from someone else made it harder to dismiss, harder to explain away, and I kept my voice steady when I asked, "What do you mean?" And Linda shrugged lightly, like it was common knowledge, like something everyone already knew except me. "Oh, just that the house sold quickly, and for a good price too. I heard it was over 600,000. Must have been a nice deal." And I smiled, the same polite smile I had worn so many times before, but this time it felt different, thinner, more controlled, because now the pieces were no longer scattered. They were starting to align. The overheard conversation, the listing online, the casual confirmation from someone outside my home, all pointing to the same truth, a truth that had been sitting quietly in front of me while I tried not to see it. And as I walked back inside, holding the mail in my hand, I realized something had shifted inside me as well. Something subtle but permanent, because doubt had turned into certainty, and certainty does not ask questions the way doubt does. It waits, it observes, it prepares. And when I stepped into the living room and saw Sophia adjusting the furniture again, moving things an inch to the left, an inch to the right, like she was refining something that belonged to her, I did not feel confused anymore. I did not feel uncertain. I felt clear enough to understand that whatever they were doing here, whatever plan they had not shared with me, I was no longer just part of the background, and I would not remain unaware for much longer. That evening, I stopped telling myself it was temporary. I stopped repeating the same quiet excuses that had helped me stay comfortable in my own denial, because comfort has a way of blinding you, and I could no longer afford to be blind, not in my own home. So I began to move differently, not in a way they would notice, not in a way that would create questions, but in small, deliberate ways. The kind that come from years of learning when to speak and when to stay silent. And I started with something simple, something ordinary. I began to listen more carefully, not just to what they said, but to how they said it, to the pauses, to the things left unfinished. And it did not take long to notice that Daniel no longer discussed plans in front of me. Conversations would stop when I entered the room. Voices would lower just enough to signal that I was not meant to hear. And Sophia had begun making calls during the day, pacing slowly through the living room with a calm, confident tone, talking about timelines, about arrangements, about things being almost ready. And every time I heard those words, I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper inside me, because people do not speak like that unless they are working towards something specific, something already in motion. And one afternoon, while they were out running errands, I walked back into the master bedroom, the room that had once been mine, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with a kind of calm I had not felt in days. And I looked around carefully, noticing what had changed, what had been added, what had been removed. And that was when I saw it, a folder resting on a nightstand, partially tucked beneath a book, not hidden, but not meant to be obvious either. And for a moment, I stood still, considering whether I should leave it untouched, whether I should continue waiting. But then I reminded myself of something simple. This was my house, my room, my life that had been quietly rearranged without my permission. And I reached for the folder slowly, opening it just enough to see what was inside. And there it was, printed clearly, neatly organized, documents that confirmed what I already suspected and more than I had expected. The sale of their house, the final closing amount, $620,000. The number written in bold, undeniable, and beneath it, a transfer confirmation. The funds directed not into a joint account, not into something shared, but into an account under Sophia's name alone. And I felt no shock, no sudden rush of emotion, just a steady clarity, because the truth once seen, does not need to announce itself. It simply settles into place. And as I closed the folder carefully and returned it exactly where I'd found it, I understood something with complete certainty. They were not here because they had no options. They were here because they had chosen. Chosen my home, chosen my space, chosen me, not out of need, but out of convenience. And as I walked back down the hallway, past the living room that no longer felt entirely like mine, I realized that whatever they believed they were building here, whatever plan they thought I would never see, they had made one mistake. They had assumed I would remain the same, the quiet, accommodating mother who did not question, who did not notice, who did not act. And that assumption, more than anything else, was the one thing they should not have relied on. From that moment on, I did not rush, because rushing is what people do when they are afraid, and I was no longer afraid. I was aware, and awareness changes the way you move, the way you speak, the way you exist in your own space. So instead of confronting them, instead of asking questions they would only answer with half-truths, I chose something else. I chose to let them believe nothing had changed, and that was the easiest part, because they already believed it. They believed I was still the same woman who would quietly adjust, who would make space without hesitation, who would accept whatever explanation they decided to offer. And so I continued as I had before. I made dinner, I set the table, I asked simple questions that required simple answers, and I watched, always watched. And it was remarkable how quickly people reveal themselves when they think they're no longer being observed. Sophia became more confident, more comfortable speaking openly about plans that were no longer vague, mentioning things like renovations, like timelines, like when everything is finalized, as if the future she was describing already included this house as part of it. And Daniel followed her, led, agreeing more than speaking, nodding more than questioning, and I saw something in him I had not seen before. Not just distance, but compliance, a quiet willingness to let someone else decide the direction of his life. And that realization did not hurt the way I expected it to. It did not break me. It clarified something I had overlooked for too long. And one evening, as we sat at the table, Sophia looked around the room, her gaze moving slowly across the walls, the furniture, the layout, and she said, almost thoughtfully, "This place really has potential if it is updated properly." And Daniel nodded, adding, "Yeah, we could make it a lot more functional." And I took a small sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle, because that word, we had not gone unnoticed. It had not been spoken casually. It had been placed there deliberately. And I realized then that they were not just living in my home. They were planning around it, shaping it in their minds as something that would eventually belong to them in more than just convenience. And later that night, as I sat alone in the guest room, I allowed myself to think not about what they had done, but about what they intended to do next. And the answer was no longer difficult to see. They had money, they had options, and yet they had chosen this, chosen to settle into my home as if it were a temporary step towards something larger, something that did not include asking me for permission. And that was when I understood the final piece. This was not about needing a place to stay. This was about positioning, about placing themselves exactly where they needed to be before making their next move. And as I turned off the light and laid back against the unfamiliar pillow, I felt a calm settle over me. Not the kind of calm that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from clarity, because now that I could see the full shape of what was happening, I also knew something they did not. They believed they were the only ones making plans, and that was no longer true. The next morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I left the house without telling them where I was going, not out of secrecy, but out of intention, because for the first time since they arrived, I understood that information, like space, had to be managed carefully, and I drove across town to a place I had not visited in years, a small office building with quiet hallways and soft lighting. The kind of place where decisions are made without noise, where things are put into writing so they cannot be undone by words later. And as I sat across from Mr. Reynolds, the attorney who had handled my husband's affairs years ago, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, not comfort exactly, but something close to control, because this was a space where I understood the rules, where clarity mattered more than emotion, and I explained only what was necessary, that my son and his wife were living with me, that their financial situation was not what they had presented, that I wanted to understand my options, and he listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his expression steady, professional, and when I finished, he leaned back slightly and said, "Margaret, the most important thing right now is to make sure your assets are protected, especially your home." And that word, protected, settled into my mind with a kind of quiet weight because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was not just about discomfort or misunderstanding. This was about risk. And as he explained the process, the documents, the legal structures that could ensure my home remained mine, no matter who lived inside it, I listened carefully, asking questions when needed, taking in every detail because knowledge, I realized, was not just power, it was protection. And by the time I left his office, I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was preparing for what might come next. And when I returned home that afternoon, nothing on the surface had changed. Sophia was in the kitchen again, rearranging something that had already been arranged. Daniel was on his phone. The television was on in the background, the same quiet takeover continuing, as if it were invisible. And I moved through the house the same way I always had, calm, steady, offering no sign that anything inside me had shifted, because there's a kind of strength in being underestimated, in allowing others to believe they're still in control. And that evening, when Sophia mentioned again how this place could really be something with the right updates, I simply smiled and said, "I suppose it depends on who it belongs to." And she paused just for a second, just long enough for me to see the flicker of uncertainty cross her face before it disappeared again. And that was when I knew, not just suspected, but knew that I was no longer standing on the outside of whatever plan they were building. I was inside it now, aware of its shape, its direction, its intent, and more importantly, I was no longer unprepared. Because while they were busy imagining a future that included this house as theirs, I had already begun making sure that future would never belong to them. After that conversation, I did not change my routine, at least not in any way they could see, because the most effective way to understand someone's intentions is to let them believe nothing has interrupted their plan. And so I continued as before, quiet, observant, present, but not intrusive. And over the next few days, their behavior became even more revealing, not because they intended it to be, but because confidence has a way of loosening caution. And Sophia, in particular, had begun to speak more openly, not directly to me, but within earshot, as if she had already decided that I was no longer part of the equation that mattered. And one afternoon, while I was in the hallway folding a stack of clean towels, I heard her on the phone again, her voice calm, assured, discussing what sounded like a timeline, mentioning phrases like, "Once everything is finalized, and we will not need to rush the next step." And there was a pause, followed by a quiet laugh. And then she said something that made my hands still completely. "No, the house is not an issue. We are already in position." And I did not need to ask what she meant, because I understood it now in a way I had not before. This was not just about living arrangements. This was strategy, placement, a deliberate step towards something they believed was already within reach. And later that evening, as we sat together in the living room, Daniel mentioned, almost casually, that they might stay longer than expected, that things were taking more time to sort out. And I nodded, offering the same calm acceptance I had given from the beginning, even though I could now see the structure beneath the words, the way each explanation was designed to extend their presence without inviting questions. And I realized then that their plan depended on something very simple, something they had relied on without ever needing to say it. They believed I would not challenge them, that I would continue to accommodate, to adjust, to allow. And that belief was the foundation of everything they were doing. And as I sat there, listening to them speak about timelines and possibilities, as if they were discussing a future that did not require my consent, I felt no anger, no sudden need to confront them, only a steady awareness that their certainty was built on an assumption that was no longer true. And that was when I began to think not just about protecting what was mine, but about how and when to reveal that protection, because timing, I realized, mattered just as much as preparation. And for now, the most important thing was to let them continue exactly as they were, to let them move forward with a plan they believed was unseen, because the more confident they became, the more complete their picture would be. And when the moment came, I would not need to argue or explain. I would only need to show them what they had failed to consider from the very beginning, that this house, this space they had so carefully positioned themselves within, was never something they could claim simply by being present. And As I watched Sophia adjust a set of keys on the table, as if deciding where they belonged, I understood something with complete clarity. They thought they were securing their future, but in reality, they were revealing it to me piece by piece. And I was paying attention to every single one. By the end of that week, I had already signed the documents, not all at once, not in a way that would draw attention, but carefully step by step, guided by someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and when it needed to be done. And as I sat across from Mr. Reynolds again, pen in hand, I felt something settle inside me that I had not felt in days, not since they first walked through my door. A sense of certainty that did not depend on what they said or what they planned, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about securing. And when I finished signing, he looked at me and said, "From this point forward, everything is structured the way you requested." And I nodded, not asking him to repeat it, not needing further explanation, because I had listened closely the first time. I understood exactly what had been put into place, what had been protected, and more importantly, what could no longer be taken or assumed or quietly shifted away from me without my consent. And when I returned home that afternoon, the house felt the same on the surface. The same furniture, the same walls, the same quiet hum of activity, but something fundamental had changed, not in the structure, but in the balance. And as I walked into the kitchen, Sophia was standing at the counter again, reviewing something on her phone, her expression focused, controlled, as if she was managing a timeline that only she fully understood. And Daniel glanced up briefly before returning to whatever he was reading, and I moved through the space without hesitation, without pause, because hesitation suggests uncertainty, and I had none left. And that evening, as we sat together at the table, Sophia brought up the idea again, not directly, but carefully, suggesting that it might be time to think about long-term arrangements, mentioning how it would be more practical if everyone was aligned, if decisions were made collectively. And I listened, letting her speak, letting her outline a future that assumed my agreement without ever asking for it. And when she finished, I simply said, "That depends on what is already in place." And she looked at me, just for a moment, her expression tightening slightly before she smoothed it over. And Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing between us, as if sensing something he could not quite define. And I realized then that the dynamic had already begun to shift, not in a way they could fully see yet, but in a way they could feel, like a subtle change in direction that had not yet revealed its destination. And over the next few days, I continued exactly as before, calm, composed, present, giving them no reason to suspect that anything had changed beyond what they could observe. And that was the point, because plans are most effective when they are invisible, when they exist quietly beneath the surface while everything else appears unchanged. And as I watched them move through the house, discussing possibilities, making small adjustments, speaking about the future as if it were already theirs to shape, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed they were getting closer to securing what they wanted. But in reality, every step they took was bringing them closer to a moment they had not prepared for, a moment where assumption would meet reality. And when that moment arrived, there would be no argument, no negotiation, only the truth presented in a way that could not be ignored or undone. And until then, I would continue exactly as I had been, watching, waiting, and allowing them to believe that nothing had changed at all. It happened 3 days later, not with a dramatic announcement or a raised voice, but with something much quieter, something far more revealing, because the truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows itself in the way people begin to act when they believe the outcome is already theirs. And that morning, Sophia walked into the kitchen with a kind of confidence that had grown steadily over the past week. Her movements more certain, her tone more decisive, and she placed a set of printed papers on the counter as if they were already agreed upon. And she said, "I've been looking into some renovation options, nothing major, just updates that would really increase the value." And I looked at the papers without reaching for them, without reacting, because the way she said it mattered more than what she was saying. The assumption beneath her words was no longer subtle. It was clear, and Daniel stood beside her, not speaking at first, but nodding slightly as if he had already accepted everything she had decided. And I realized then that this was the moment they had been moving toward, not the final step, but the point where they expected me to follow without question, to agree without resistance, to step aside without even realizing I had been asked to do so. And Sophia continued, explaining timelines, budgets, possibilities, all framed as if they were improvements for all of us, as if the house had already shifted from being mine to being something shared, something open for adjustment. And when she finally paused, waiting for a response, I lifted my eyes to meet hers, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a calm that did not invite negotiation, and I said, "That will not be necessary." And the silence that followed was immediate, sharp in its stillness, because it was the first time I had not adjusted, the first time I had not agreed. And Daniel looked at me, confused at first, as if he had misheard, and then slightly unsettled, as if something had changed in a way he could not yet understand. And Sophia's expression tightened, just for a moment before she smiled again, that same controlled smile she had used from the beginning, and she said, "We are only trying to help, Margaret." And I nodded once, slowly, and replied, "I understand that, but this is not something you need to help with." And there was something in the way I said it, something steady and final, that made the room feel different, not tense, not hostile, but shifted, like a line had been drawn that could not be ignored. And for the rest of the day, they were quieter, more careful, their conversations more contained, as if they were recalibrating, trying to understand what had changed and how it affected what they had been planning. And I moved through the house as I always had, calm, composed, giving nothing away beyond what I had already said, because the purpose of that moment had not been to confront them fully. Not yet. It had been to let them see that the ground beneath them was not as stable as they believed, that the assumptions they had built everything on were beginning to shift. And that evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the same room that had felt unfamiliar just days before, I realized that the next step would not be theirs. It would be mine, because they had shown me enough, more than enough. And now it was simply a matter of choosing the right moment to show them exactly what they had failed to understand from the very beginning. The moment came the following afternoon, not because I rushed toward it, but because everything had already been set into place, and all that remained was to allow it to unfold. And I chose a time when we were all in the same room, not for confrontation, but for clarity, because clarity does not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. It only requires the truth presented without hesitation. And I had prepared for that, not just emotionally, but practically. And as we sat at the table, the same table where so many quiet shifts had taken place over the past days, I placed a single folder in front of me, not opening it immediately, not drawing attention to it yet, because timing matters, and I let the conversation begin as it always did, Sophia speaking first, continuing her discussion about next steps, about how things would be easier once everything was aligned, about how living together long-term could benefit everyone. And Daniel nodded along, adding small comments, reinforcing the idea that this arrangement was not just temporary, but something that was gradually becoming permanent. And I listened without interrupting, letting them build their case fully, letting every assumption settle into the room, because assumptions, once spoken aloud, become much easier to dismantle. And when they finally paused, expecting the same quiet agreement I had given before, I reached for the folder and opened it slowly, placing the documents on the table between us, and I said calmly, "I think it is time we are all clear about something." And the shift was immediate, subtle, but undeniable, their attention moving from their own expectations to what was in front of them. And I slid the first page forward, the legal structure, the trust, the documentation that defined exactly what this house was and what it was not. And I watched their expressions carefully, not searching for reaction, but observing recognition, the moment when understanding begins to replace assumption. And I continued, "This house is no longer something that can be changed, transferred, or included in any plans without my direct control." And Daniel frowned slightly, confusion turning into something more focused as he read, while Sophia's posture stiffened just enough to reveal that she understood the implications before he did. And I did not rush. I did not explain more than necessary, because the document spoke clearly enough. And after a moment, Daniel looked up at me and said, "Mom, what is this?" And I met his gaze steadily and replied, "It is protection." And the words settled between us, simple, direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And Sophia leaned forward, her tone more measured now, more careful, asking questions about what it meant, about what could and could not be done. And I answered only what was required, nothing more, nothing less, because this was not a negotiation, it was a statement. And as the silence returned to the room, heavier this time, more defined, I realized that everything had shifted completely, not in a way that could be undone or explained away, but in a way that forced them to see what had always been true, that this house, this space they had stepped into with quiet certainty, was never theirs to shape, never theirs to assume. And as I gathered the documents back into the folder, I added one final sentence, not loud, not emotional, just clear. You are welcome to stay here, but only as guests, nothing more. And I saw it then, not anger, not outrage, but something else, something quieter. The realization that the position they believed they had secured no longer existed, and that everything they'd been building their plans on had just been removed, calmly, completely, and without a single raised voice. They did not respond right away, and that silence told me more than any argument could have, because silence, when it follows certainty, is not confusion, it is recognition, and I watched it settle over them, slowly, unevenly, Daniel still trying to process what he had just read, what it meant, what had changed without him realizing it. And Sophia sitting straighter now, her expression controlled but no longer confident, her mind already moving ahead, recalculating, adjusting, searching for a way to respond that would restore the balance she believed she had. But there was no balance left to restore, not the one she had imagined, and I did not fill the silence for them. I let it remain, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow people to sit with the reality they have been avoiding. And after a moment, Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had heard it in days. You should have told us. And I looked at him, not with disappointment, not with anger, but with a clarity that had taken me days to reach. And I said, you should have told me the truth. And that was all. No accusation, no raised voice, just a simple correction that shifted the weight of the moment back to where it belonged. And he looked down at the papers again, not arguing, not pushing back, because there was nothing there to argue with, only facts, only decisions already made. And Sophia leaned back slightly, her tone measured, careful now, asking, so what happens next? And I answer without hesitation, that depends on you, because for the first time since they arrived, it truly did, and the days that followed were quieter, not tense, not hostile, but different, like a room where the furniture has been rearranged and everyone is still adjusting to the new layout. Sophia stopped making comments about changes, about improvements, about what the house could be, and Daniel began speaking to me more directly, asking small questions again, offering help in ways he had not before, as if something in him had shifted back, not completely, but enough to be noticeable. I did not push, I did not revisit the conversation, because the purpose had never been to win. It had been to make something clear, something that could not be undone once it was seen. And over time, their presence in the house began to feel different, lighter, more temporary, not because they said it was, but because they no longer moved as if it were permanent. And one evening, as I stood in the kitchen alone, the house quiet around me, in a way it had not been since they arrived, I realized something simple, something that had been there all along, but had only now fully settled into place. I had not lost my home. I had not lost my place. I had only been tested in a way I had not expected, and I had answered in a way they had not prepared for. And as I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, past the rooms that had been shifted and adjusted and slowly returned to something closer to what they had been before, I understood that some lessons do not need to be spoken aloud. They're understood in the space that remains after everything unnecessary has been cleared away. And if there was one thing I knew with certainty now, it was this: they had come into my home believing they could reshape it around themselves. But in the end, all they had done was reveal exactly where they stood, and that was something I would never overlook again.